Margaret Beaufort's legacy remains captivating to this day. The English National Archives, for instance, describe her as the most powerful woman in Tudor England, albeit with the caveat that this applies to early Tudor England. She has been characterized as the uncrowned queen, the mother of the Tudor dynasty, and the king's mother, with the latter term coined by Michael K. Jones and Malcolm G. Underwood. Their 1993 paperback biography remains the definitive work on Margaret's life. Sarah Gristwood's assessment that an entirely new role had to be created for the king's mother is also widely acclaimed. In recent years, several noteworthy contributions, particularly in essay form, have emerged. Sally Fisher's Margaret R., Lady Margaret Beaufort's Self-Fashioning and Female Ambition, and Rebecca Osawa's 2011 master's thesis, Emotional Intelligence, EI, in the Life and Career of Lady Margaret Beaufort, a 1403-1509, deserve special mention and have significantly influenced my perspective. The extent of her power remains a subject of debate. Did she overshadow Queen Elizabeth of York, as some suggest? Was her ascent tainted by the blood of the princes in the Tower? I aim to explore these questions, though my conclusions about her possible involvement in their deaths will depend heavily on my overall assessment of her character. That is why I only talk about the princes at the end of this video. But enough of the preface. Henry Parker, the 10th Baron Morley, best known as one of Anne Boleyn's jurors, recalled that Margaret Beaufort faced mortal danger multiple times during Richard III's reign. As a boy, he had served her and held her in high regard. His memory did not deceive him. The greatest danger came in the autumn of 1483, when Margaret participated in the Buckingham Rebellion against Richard III. Various sources suggest she was even the mastermind. Paul Murray Kendall, for instance, refers to her as the Athena of rebellion. Her son, Henry Tudor, was to return from French exile with troops to support the rebellious Duke. However, Richard swiftly defeated Buckingham, and Henry had to flee back into exile. Under ordinary circumstances, Margaret's involvement would have cost her life. However, her husband, Thomas Stanley, remained loyal to the Yorkist king and helped quash the rebellion. Consequently, Richard spared her, placing her under house arrest on her husband's estate and giving him control over her property. Parliament recorded Richard's thoughts on Margaret.
Forasmuch as Margaret Countess of Richmond, mother to the king's great rebel and traitor, Henry Earl of Richmond, hath of late conspired, considered, and committed high treason against our sovereign lord, the King Richard III, in diverse and sundry ways, and especially in sending messages, writings, and tokens to the said Henry. Also the said countess made chevauchances of great sums of money, and also the said countess conspired, considered, and imagined the destruction of our said sovereign lord.
Margaret had reached her lowest point. Deprived of her means and reputation, all hopes of securing her son's rights seemed lost. The year 1483 was one of the darkest in her life. She was on the verge of convincing Edward IV to allow her son's return when he died. She then supported Richard and played a key role in the coronation of his queen, Anne Neville. But this effort went unrewarded. The secret marriage pact between her son and Elizabeth of York seemed futile after Buckingham's defeat. However, for her whole life, Margaret's rivals consistently underestimated her. At 9, she was given a choice between marrying Edmund Tudor or John de la Pole. Although King Henry VI preferred his half-brother, Edmund, Margaret asked for time to decide, shocking the court. Bishop John Fisher, her spiritual advisor, recounted what happened next.
And as she lay in prayer, calling upon the saint, Saint Nicholas, whether asleep or awake she could not remember, about 4 o'clock in the morning, a figure appeared before her, dressed in white, rather like a bishop, and naming Edmund, bade her take him as her husband.
Married at 13 and soon widowed, she bore Henry and survived despite the risks associated with childbirth at such a young age. Fisher considered it a miracle that she survived and bore a healthy child. The death of her second husband, Henry Stafford, in 1471 was a setback, but she remarried Thomas Stanley a year later. Although there is agreement that the relationship with her new husband was merely a partnership of convenience, she was able to convince him to allow her to continue contact with her son and to support him financially. The relationship between Thomas and Margaret warrants further historical investigation. The assessment by Jones and Underwood that she was never emotionally part of the Stanley family seems overly harsh to me. In 1485, Margaret Beaufort orchestrated a pivotal moment by financing her son's second invasion of England. This effort succeeded largely due to Thomas Stanley, who chose to support his stepson Henry rather than his reigning king at the Battle of Bosworth. It was Stanley who placed the crown on Henry's head. Following this victory, Margaret became the family's undisputed matriarch. Parliament swiftly revoked the punitive measures Richard III had imposed on her and declared her a sole femme, granting her full legal rights and control over her vast property. As one of the wealthiest individuals of her time, Margaret's fortune became a critical financial reserve for the perpetually cash-strapped English crown, ensuring economic stability in emergencies. This financial security was a significant factor in undermining the support for pretenders like Lambert Simnel and Perkin Warbeck among the English nobility. While Henry's claim to the throne was tenuous, the financial and military backing from his mother and father-in-law solidified his position. Despite Margaret's influence, Henry was not entirely dependent on her. She expressed doubts about his marriage to Elizabeth of York, which he ignored, marrying her on January 18, 1486. This decision did not create a rift between mother and son. On the contrary, Margaret took on the wardship of Edward Plantagenet and Edward Stafford, the third Duke of Buckingham. This wardship, particularly of Plantagenet, was crucial as he was seen as a potential heir to Richard III. Margaret's role as guardian demonstrated the king's immense trust in her. Plantagenet remained in her custody until Henry's position on the throne was secure. Only then he was transferred to the Tower of London. Margaret performed her wardship duties diligently, refraining from exploiting her wards, which was highly unusual for the time. This neutrality prevented any immediate threat from the Stafford family. Although Henry VIII eventually executed Edward, Duke of Buckingham, Margaret had ensured a stable political environment during the early Tudor period. However, despite regretting her lack of Latin proficiency, Margaret's assertiveness and passion for higher education inevitably brought her into conflict with the Queen. As the Countess of Richmond and Derby and Queen of Man, Margaret refused to accept a status inferior to Elizabeth of York. She wore robes of identical quality and walked only half a step behind her. Margaret made many decisions regarding family life, including setting protocols for her granddaughter's birth, baptism, and nursery arrangements. While she collaborated with Elizabeth of York on some matters, their cooperation was limited. Margaret often travelled with the royal couple, including attending Prince Arthur's marriage to Catherine of Aragon. Some historians suggest a strained relationship between Margaret and Elizabeth, but there is no concrete evidence. Elizabeth seemed content to let Margaret handle political matters. It is as biographer Amy Licence noted, "Only one person really knew how Elizabeth of York felt about Margaret Beaufort, and she didn't put it on paper." Margaret's rivalry was more pronounced with another queen, Elizabeth Woodville. Edward IV's widow was banished from court in 1487, and one theory suggests Margaret's involvement. However, it is more likely that Elizabeth Woodville's political influence waned because her daughter, Elizabeth of York, did not challenge Margaret's authority, leading to frustration and eventual exile. As Queen Mother, Margaret faced one of the most challenging tasks of her time, maintaining order in northern England and the Midlands, areas historically difficult to govern due to their proximity to Scotland and Wales. Traditionally, loyal followers were appointed to manage these regions. Edward IV had relied on his brother, Richard, Duke of Gloucester, creating the office of High Commissioner of the Council of the North in 1472. Margaret effectively assumed this role. Historians Rachel Reed, Bertha Haven, and Pearl Hogreff argue convincingly that she even acted officially in this capacity, administering justice on behalf of the king and herself. Margaret functioned as what we would now call the Governor of the North, and her governance was notably effective. Her grandson, Henry VIII, initially refrained from appointing a successor to her role, but felt forced to do so, caused the old conflicts returned after Margaret was gone, a testament to her competence. The regions under her direct control remained relatively peaceful, unlike under subsequent rulers. The frequent assertion that Margaret retired from political life around 1499 to focus on foundations like St. John's College at Cambridge and the still existing Lady Margaret's Professorship of Divinity is overstated. While she did scale back her activities due to age, she remained politically active. Her most significant political influence was yet to come. Margaret Beaufort's power was deeply rooted in her relationship with her son, Henry VII, characterized by profound trust and mutual respect. Henry once wrote to her,
"Not only in this, but in all other things that I may know should be to your honor and pleasure, and will of yourself. I shall be as glad to please you as your heart can desire."
Margaret, in turn, referred to Henry as
"My dearest and only beloved joy in the world."
Naturally, she saw herself as a bearer of royal power, taking on numerous legations for her son and even altering her signature from M. Richmond, referencing her lands, to Margaret R., adding "by the King's Moder." The R likely stood for Regina, which is Latin for queen, aligning with Henry's own use of Henry R. for Rex. Margaret skillfully tailored her language to suit her audience. In a particular letter, she writes,
"Wherefore we desire and pray you to be so favourable to them at this time by your wisdom, that they are not wrong to their unbearable loss and undoing, but that these representatives of the said town may have good and comfortable answer of their suits to the King's grace at this time, wherein in our opinion you shall do a right goodly and meritorious deed."
Here she avoids a direct command, but implies that complying with her wish would be a personal favor, using phrases like desire and right goodly and meritorious deed to soften her request. In another example, addressing a subordinate, she writes,
"To our servant Richard Shirley, bailiff of town of Ware. Richard Shirley we send unto you at this time, the King's servant, clerk of the market, this bearer, for ordinance and devising of victuals as well, for man as beast within our town there, willing you to help and assist him in the same, the best you can, and thereupon to do the execution thereof, as you tender our pleasure."
Here Margaret clearly states her wishes without mentioning the king's consent, indicating her autonomous authority. Margaret's influence extended beyond England's borders. A Spanish envoy reported,
"The Queen is a very noble woman and much beloved. She is kept in subjection by the mother of the king. It would be a good thing to write often to her and to show her a little love."
The years 1502 and 1503 plunged Henry VII into a deep emotional and political crisis with the deaths of his heir, Arthur, and his wife, Elizabeth of York. During this period of profound grief, Margaret emerged as a stabilizing force. Having committed to a chaste life with her husband's consent, she became increasingly present at the royal court, even writing the ordinances for Elizabeth of York's funeral. Henry's incapacitation due to grief necessitated Margaret's covert regency. Her home, the Palace of Collyweston, functioned as an alternative royal court, where she entertained and negotiated with significant political figures. She insisted that her granddaughter, Margaret Tudor, could delay the consummation of her marriage to James IV of Scotland, seeking to prevent her from enduring a fate similar to her own. In 1506, when Philip of Austria and his wife Juana, Queen of Castile, were shipwrecked in England, Margaret managed their care until Emperor Maximilian agreed to exchange the couple for Edmund de la Pole. The Habsburgs only conceded after Henry promised, likely with Margaret's approval, to spare the life of one of the last Yorkists. Reginald Pole later spoke respectfully of Margaret. Margaret's alternative court was extremely valuable for Henry. Typically, such courts either support a future monarch or become a haven for political dissidents. Margaret's court was the former, providing a safe space for grievances without having to fear the king, but also without threatening him. Her loyalty ensured the court reinforced rather than undermined Henry's power. When Henry VII fell seriously ill in 1508, Margaret remained by his side, offering emotional support and actively participating in governance. She influenced the composition of her grandson, Henry VIII's Privy Council, and organized his coronation in 1509, solidifying her enduring legacy. Margaret Beaufort's relationship with her grandson, Henry VIII, was complex. While it lacked the profound love she had for her son, Henry VII, there was still genuine affection. For instance, Margaret once attended a tournament where the future king participated with a saddle and harness she had given him. However, their relationship was not without its challenges. Henry's marriage to Catherine of Aragon before his coronation was a unilateral decision, and he began revising many of his father's policies, which were significantly influenced by Margaret. This naturally put him at odds with her. Historian Elizabeth Norton described Margaret as a regent for Henry VIII while he was still a minor, but this is inaccurate. Officially, Henry took over full royal duties immediately. Margaret, for the first time since 1485, realized that her power was largely contingent on the king's support. Before any serious conflict could arise, she passed away, just one day after Henry's 18th birthday and 5 days after his coronation. Allegedly, a young swan served at dinner was her undoing. Margaret was buried in the Lady Chapel of Westminster Abbey, close to her son and his wife. At her funeral, John Fisher praised her, saying,
She was bounteous and liberal to every person of her knowledge or acquaintance. Avarice and covetise she most hated, and sorrowed at full mochi in all persons, but specially in any that belonged unto her. She was of singular easiness to be spoken unto, and full courtese answer she would make to all that came unto her. Of marvellous gentleness she was unto all folks, but specially unto her own, whom she trusted, and loved right tenderly. Unkeened she would not be unto no creature, ne forgetful of ony kindness or service done to her before, which is no little part of very nobleness. She was not vengeable ne cruel, but ready anon to forget, and to forgive injuries done unto her, at the least desire or motion made unto her for the same. Merciful also and piteous she was unto such as was graved and wrongfully troubled, and to them that were in poverty and sickness, or any other misery.
This aligns with most contemporary accounts of her. It wasn't until the 17th century that the image of a cold and calculating Margaret Beaufort emerged, a portrayal that persists in popular culture today. The 17th century also saw Margaret being accused for the first time of eliminating the princes in the Tower. William Cornwallis and George Buck leveled this accusation, with Buck claiming he had found evidence in an old manuscript, though he never revealed its origin or quoted from it. Contemporaries never accused Margaret of such a crime. Anyone who refers to this for Richard must also accept this for Margaret. However, Tudor historians took it a step further. According to Polydore Virgil, Margaret was so alarmed by the fate of the princes that she not only supported the Buckingham Rebellion, but led it. While it's debatable whether she had the opportunity to commit such an act, it seems unlikely. Margaret had the chance to eliminate political threats like Edward Plantagenet and Edward Stafford, yet she treated them well. Henry VII himself showed similar restraint with impostors like Lambert Simnel and Perkin Warbeck, at least until Warbeck proved a persistent threat. Those who believe Warbeck was one of the princes in the Tower might find Margaret's behavior suspicious. She only adopted Margaret R. the year Plantagenet and Warbeck were executed, which some might interpret as her acknowledging the true king's death. Officially, this change was attributed to her oath of chastity. Margaret had crafted her identity around being the king's mother. Describing Margaret's power and role remains challenging because she always acted like a mother. She promoted higher education, treated those entrusted to her well, and dispensed justice, embodying the role of the mother of the kingdom. She served three masters: God, the monarch, and the people, making her unique among the women of the Tudor dynasty and the Wars of the Roses. Thanks for watching. Please like and subscribe.